Okay, in this session, I just want to quickly go over CDK and CDK bootstrapping specifically. So I won't go into great detail on what CDK is, but just at a high level, when you're deploying application solutions with resources, with AWS resources into AWS, it's best to use CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is a text version of all your configuration items of your resources. So for example, you've got an S3 bucket and you've got a Lambda function, and you might want to control the permissions just to allow the Lambda function to read only from the S3 bucket. So those kind of settings are defined in CloudFormation, and they're defined in a CloudFormation template, either using JSON or YAML. But that process is a little bit manual and tedious at times. So then AWS have come out with Aws Cdk, which is the cloud development kit. And it exists as a higher level abstract layer to build out CloudFormation templates. So you can think of CDK it's actually a group of libraries and packages, and they help you build out CloudFormation templates in YAML and JSON. Now, the process of converting a CDK solution into CloudFormation template, it's called synthesis, or basically it's a translation layer. And so they just call it synthesis, and they've got synthesizers to do that translation. Anyway, going back, bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is just a way of setting up your account, specifically your account and region, so that it can accept CDK solutions to be deployed into that region in that specific account, right? So in CDK, the term environment is a combination of a specific AWS account and a region. So if you can think of, we've got one production AWS account, right? And that has a Sydney region and that has a US region. So the Sydney region is one environment and the US region is a separate environment. So if you were to want to deploy your CDK solution into the Sydney region, you'd need to bootstrap that environment. And if you want to deploy into the US region, you also have to separately bootstrap or set up into that environment. Okay, so the reasons for bootstrapping is when you are using assets, so that's specifically file assets, when your CloudFormation template is exceeding 50 kilobytes, and when it's using a synthesizer. So in bootstrapping or CDK, there's actually two synthesizers. There's the default synthesizer and also the new style stack synthesizer. So you can think of this as the legacy, and this is the newer version. We're going to be mainly using the newer version, and I'll get to that later. And so bootstrapping is just making sure that each of our environments are set up to accept CDK solutions. So just to repeat, you build out a solution in CDK, so the CloudFormation toolkit or development kit, and then that gets translated into a CloudFormation template using the synthesizer, and then CloudFormation will deploy your solution. Okay, so I'll just scroll down. Okay, so bootstrapping. So bootstrapping or setup is pretty straightforward. So the command to run is CDK bootstrap, then you specify the account and the region. And then you can also bootstrap multiple accounts and regions with the single command. Okay. Now it's showing you've got a few things that you can do here. So CDK bootstrap, you can show the template and output the template into this YAML document. So As I said, when you want to deploy resources or things into your AWS account, you normally deploy it via CloudFormation, which exists as a YAML template or is defined as a YAML template. And that also goes for the bootstrapping process. When you want to bootstrap your environment, what it does is it's creating a CloudFormation template with the required components and resources to support the CDK framework. Okay. Okay, so just going back a bit, CDK is a command line program. Okay, so we'll just go to the command line, and you've already seen that AWS CLI is a command line application. It allows you to run commands in the command prompt against your own AWS account. So you can run things like AWS S3 LS, which will list out all of the S3 buckets on your account. Okay, now once you've installed that, you've authenticated into your account, you can also run the CDK solution. So the CDK CLI basically is another application that sits alongside the AWS CLI package. So CDK, and it gives you all this information and all the parameters that you can use. But all we're going to be doing is, in this example, CDK bootstrap, show me the template and output the template here. So what this is going to do is just generate the CloudFormation template that I need to deploy into my environment, which will set up my environment ready to accept future CDK solutions. Okay, now I said that there's two versions. So there's actually a CDK version 1 and version 2. So version 1 being the legacy, version 2 being the more recent one. And we're going to also run that command. Okay, so it's using the new style bootstrapping, and that has generated a bootstrap template.yaml into my local directory, which I've got here. And see, it's just a basic CloudFormation template. It's got a whole bunch of parameters, so trusted accounts, bucket name for file assets and whatnot. Okay, I won't go into great detail here, but when you end up deploying it, you deploy it into your account, and normally it's using the name of CDK Toolkit. And here you can see the same sort of template that's been deployed into our development account. So you've got, again, trusted accounts, you've got all these resources here, and this has all been deployed into this development account to set up this account to accept CDK solutions. So when you click on resources, you can see all the different types of resources that have been deployed. So you've got SSM for parameters. So that's just storing the version of the bootstrap that has been deployed. So there's actually different versions of their bootstrap. And then you've got an S3 bucket. So I mentioned assets. So sometimes you need a temporary location to store assets for the deployment process. So that's where the staging bucket is used. And then you've got a whole bunch of these other application roles. So here you've got a CloudFormation execution role. So this role would be likely to be used for deployment purposes. You've actually got a deployment action role, file publishing role, image publishing role, lookup role. So all of these roles exist to help support the whole process of deploying a CDK solution into your AWS account via CloudFormation. Okay, and so once you've got these set up, then you can start building your CDK solutions and then hooking them and pointing them to these toolkits. and then they can deploy into your environment. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through a few of these things. Okay, so bootstrapping templates. Now, I mentioned that there was two versions available. There's the legacy, and then there's the modern version. So version 1 and version 2. So the reason why we want to use version 2 is because of this main thing, cross-account deployments, which the legacy doesn't have, but modern does. So in our current setup with our current cross-account deployments, we have all of our application code sitting on our development accounts, and we also have all of our deployment pipelines sitting on our development account. So the development account will handle the application code and version control for the application code. It will handle the build process, the testing, the local deployment, and integration testing within the development account. And then if it meets all of those requirements, then it'll go through a gated process across into base account, staging environment, and production environment finally. Okay, so we're trying to look for a framework that also allows us to replicate that same sort of process, allows us to do most of the work within our development account. And then once it meets all the criteria and testing requirements and use cases, then we can proceed to do cross-account deployments from the same deployment pipeline. And so the modern Bootstrapped does allow us to do that. Okay, so that's why we're using modern. Then what else? This is just some configuration files. And customizing bootstrapping. Okay, so in our current setup where we've got all of our artifacts in our development account, we've also got the deployment pipeline that is in our development environment, but also spans across multiple accounts. So even though the whole pipeline exists within the development account, it has permissions to deploy into base, staging, and prod. Now, for those permissions to exist, we had set up existing permissions and agreements with the infrastructure engineering, where they said that we can deploy into production given that our resources meet a specific naming convention, for example. So let's say, just for simplicity's sake, let's say that all of our S3 buckets and Lambda functions needed to be prefixed with analytics. So that way that infrastructure know that any Lambda functions and S3 buckets that exist in production with the prefix of analytics in their name, they know that those are analytics resources. And even though those are analytics resources, we also set up in such a way that we can only access those resources with those names. So if we want to delete a resource with the prefix analytics, then we're allowed to. But say, for example, we wanted to delete a S3 bucket that didn't have that prefix, then we would automatically be denied. So in a way that we've developed a way to fence off our resources from the rest of the RACQ environment. So we're kind of like mitigating our risk and our control to the rest of the environment. So the way we set this up was with permission boundaries, and those permission boundaries define the fence. It's a virtual fence in each of the accounts that we can deploy into. So with bootstrapping, you can actually set up the same sort of thing. So as a parameter in the bootstrapping process, so you remember this command, CDK bootstrap, you can add an extra parameter, which is the CloudFormation execution policies. So the CloudFormation execution policies are a reference to policies which define the permissions the deployment account has access to. Okay, so going back, we've got our CDK solution. We want to deploy our CDK solution into a given environment, which is a region in a specific account. So let's say we want to deploy into the Sydney region on our production account. All right. Now, at the moment, we've got a permission boundary, which defines the area or types of resources that we're allowed to deploy into. And that's set up using IAM policies. So this is a way where we could reference those IAM policies and limit our permissions when it comes to deployment time. So even though here it says it has AWS IAM, it's a policy, but this policy has full access. Now, if we were to deploy this into production, we could actually define an equivalent of a permission boundary here, saying that, okay, this CDK bootstrapped environment can only deploy Lambda functions and S3 buckets with the prefix of analytics and nothing more. So we could build that into this solution. So you just tell in the bootstrapping process, CloudFormation execution policies, and list out all the policies that you want to link to your effective deployer role in the bootstrapped environment. And then it'll do that. So that means each time that you're deploying your CDK solution into an environment, it will be restricted by whatever policies you have listed out here. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to cover. Now, at the bottom of this documentation, it does have a copy of all of the changes between each of these versions of the CDK Bootstrap solution. I believe they are backwards compatible. And one of the important things I found is when you bootstrap an environment, going back to what I mentioned before, you can limit what that bootstrapped stack can do, right? So going back to here, see, I've got a CDK toolkit that has been deployed. So this is the result of the bootstrapping into this environment. And for this solution, I've set full access. So any CDK solutions that deploy using this CDK toolkit will have full access. Okay. But what I've also done is I've deployed a second instance of the CDK toolkit into this same environment. So I'm still within the Sydney region. I'm still on the same single development account, but for this specific CDK toolkit, I've started to add permission boundaries, an equivalent of permission boundaries. So when I deploy a solution against this CDK solution, then now I'm constrained by this policy document. If I was to deploy against this one, then I have full access. Okay, so this is where it might be beneficial for the infrastructure engineering team, where they might be deploying all of these things and then just making sure that, hey, for the analytics team, they can only deploy against this solution, against this CDK toolkit, but they can't actually deploy against this CDK toolkit. So you see here, down here, the trusted accounts. You can list out the trusted accounts. So let's say in production, You might have a CDK toolkit that has full access, and that could be managed by infrastructure engineering when they want to do their deployments and whatnot. But then for other teams like analytics, we might have our own CDK toolkit that's been bootstrapped into production account. And then we might have our trusted account, our development account listed here. So that means we can, from our development account, deploy against this CDK toolkit, but we won't be able to deploy against this CDK toolkit. And when we deploy against this one, then we're constrained by these permission boundaries. Okay, and so if you've noticed already, the way to actually identify which toolkit that you're deploying against is by the qualifier. So the qualifier is just an arbitrary ID that's been allocated to this instance of the CDK toolkit. Now, by default, this was the ID that was chosen. So if you don't actually specify the qualifier for your CDK toolkit, then this will be the default. And it's just a matter of changing the ID a little bit. So I've only changed the last letter from an S to an X. And then that just means now this CDK toolkit is uniquely identified by this ID now. So that just means in our application code, when we're building out our CDK solutions, we just need to make sure that we mention which qualifier to use. And let's say we don't specify a qualifier in our CDK solution, it would normally default to this. And then if our development account is not listed against this CDK toolkit, then it would just normally get denied. And then it throws some sort of error, and then we'll have to actually change our qualifier. And assuming our development account is listed under the trusted accounts, then it'd be able to use this CDK toolkit to deploy, and then it'd be constrained by these permissions. Okay, anyway, that was about it that I wanted to cover for CDK, bootstrapping, cross-account deployments, and why this really exists. All right, thanks.